Hugo was right when he said there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. Yes, the idea of freedom, liberty, and justice for all. Yes, that was the idea, but I declare that now is the time. And if America is going to have a chance at living out the true meaning of its creed, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, then we cannot afford for this nation or its leaders to have selective ambition.
Welcome to the Policy Lowdown, the podcast from the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, offering straight talk on the policies that matter most to Maryland communities. I'm your host, Kevin Slayton. One of the most important things we do together as a community is work to make sure that the next generation is set up for success. That includes things like supporting good public schools and high-quality child care so that parents can work, but also addressing poverty and ensuring kids can get the health care they need. That is going to be the focus of our conversation today. And I'm so excited. It's such a big topic, and I'm glad to have two great and outstanding guests here to look at the various issues facing children and families in Maryland and what we can do differently as a state to better set every child up for success. I'm happy to be joined by my dear friend, the Reverend Kobi Little, president of Baltimore City NAACP, and my colleague and friend in the fight, Nonso Umunna, who is the Kids Count Director for the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. Welcome to you both.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Before we get too deep into policy discussions, I'd love it if you could each share a little bit more about yourselves and your work. Reverend Little, let's start with you.
Thank you, Dr. Slayton, and I'm glad to be here on your show today. It's always good to be in your presence, and I'm grateful for the work that you do in the public interest, all of the advocacy work that you do. I am currently serving as the president of the Baltimore NAACP. I joined the NAACP when I was in college. A woman named Francine Ashby thought that it was important that all of the black students at Hopkins participated in the NAACP, and she bought us memberships. And through my experience while I was in college in the NAACP, I learned the importance of advocacy and working to speak in the interest of those who are most vulnerable, those who are too often marginalized, those who are experiencing economic insecurity, those whose constitutional rights are consistently trampled on. And so here, so many years later, I continue that work as the president of the Baltimore NAACP. And folks can find out more about our work at naacpbaltimore.org.
Thank you. And Nonso, can you please share a bit more about Kids Count and what your role is in supporting this national project?
So Kids Count is an annual release. It comes out every year, and it's been released since 1990 by the Annie Casey Foundation. And the goal of Kids Count is just to share data on a national and state level data on the well-being of children and families. And in order to do that, it tracks 16 indicators across 4 focal areas: economic well-being, health, education, and family and community. And why is this important? Because we know that economic well-being for families and children is important, because if parents are struggling or are not able to provide for their children, it impacts many aspects of their lives: health, access to quality education, nutritious food, and even future outcome. Education, we know that a good education is a determinant of future outcomes. And if a child is lacking in that area, it impacts them as well. We know the impact of health, how critical it is for children and families, and also family and community. Where the child is, the condition they're in is very important as well. So what Kids Count does, it looks at all of this, looks at how each state is faring, and then weighs and ranks them accordingly. And this year, I'll mention Maryland was ranked 19th. So MedSep is the Maryland Kids Count grantee, and we've been Kids Count grantee for close to a year this year. And our task is to ensure that we look at data relating to children, release policy on the best outcomes for children and policies for children. And we also maintain the Maryland Kids Count Data Center. which is a center that looks at different data relating to children and families. And we maintain about close to 126, more than 126 indicators that relate to children. And I think I'll ask your listeners to, if anyone needs to look at data that impacts families and children, to go on the Maryland's data center site.
Well, so there's a lot of different things we could dive deep into, but I want to start with the big picture, the budget. And as it looks for our state of Maryland, we're facing a $56 billion budget. A great percentage of that goes to health, and then education, then housing. We're talking billions of dollars. But there are different ways that the state supports children and families through state budget. And what we know across so many areas of state budget is that just because the state is making a big commitment to something does not necessarily mean that everything is going well. Nonso, what can you share with us about what the data says about how children and families are doing here in the state of Maryland?
So like I mentioned previously, Maryland is ranked 19th in terms of economic overall child well-being. And for a wealthy state, we shouldn't be in that position. I mean, we should be in a much better position than we're in. But coming back to the data, the case count data for this particular year, what we find is that there are about 12% of kids in our state living in households that are living in poverty. And that's about 153,000 kids living in poverty in our state. We have 315,000 kids who are living in households where parents lack secure employment. This is where neither parent is working full time. So we also have about 414,000, about 31% of our kids who are living in households where there's a high housing cost burden. This is where they have to spend a significant amount of their money on providing for housing alone. And that's very critical because if a parent is trying to make a decision between providing for their child, whether it's giving them a healthy food, education, and putting a roof over their head, that makes it that is a very difficult choice for them to make in order to be able to care for their child's need and make sure that they have a shelter. And we should never be a society that puts parents or children in that position. Another one is when we look, Maryland is, I have to say that not all of this is bad for Maryland. I mean, there are some positive aspects, and that's in the terms of when we're looking at healthcare, for instance. We are about 3% of kids don't have health insurance in Maryland, a consequence of the ACA health that has been able to bring this number down. But there are still 49,000 kids who do not have health care in our state. And I always think that that's 49,000 kids too many. And we should never feel like, oh, well, we're at 3%, so we're doing great. No. If 49,000 kids in our state are still without health insurance in our state, we should be doing something about that. The other one is in terms of high poverty, kids living in high poverty areas. There are 42,000 kids who are living in that particular areas that have high poverty areas. So that's what the data shows. And one other thing I also want to mention when we look at data in terms of kids count is that disaggregated data is very important because it helps us to be, because when you look at data and you say, well, for instance, the number of kids living in poverty in Maryland is coming down, so everybody feels like everybody is benefiting from it. That's often not the case. A few years ago, I was looking at data for kids living in high poverty, and the data showed that we were moving in a positive direction. But when I looked at the number disaggregated, we found that half of the kids were still African American living in poverty. So if we don't disaggregate data and see who is progressing, who is being left behind, then we can be able to say positively that everybody is benefiting. So I wanted to point that out.
Those are some startling numbers. It's been said that you can judge a society by the way it treats its children and its elders. But here in America, for too long, you can also judge us by the way we treat the other. Reverend Little, there's a long history in Maryland of investing in certain communities. How is Maryland doing in meeting the needs of all children in the state, in your opinion? And are some children in communities being left behind?
Well, I think Nonso has already painted the picture for us. The state is doing well in some areas, but there are other areas where children are being left behind, and frankly, that's unacceptable. Beyond even the poverty issues, there's a recent report out of Montgomery County that shows that there's great disparity in learning and achievement, even within one school system or even within a particular school in a school system. And that's pretty much the case for other jurisdictions around the state as well. Look, things are a lot better than they could be in Maryland, so we do celebrate that, but we've got a lot of work to do. One of the reasons that we find ourselves in the situation that we're in now is that too often policy is made for the middle group, or even worse, for the most powerful. And in the NAACP, what we have been saying to policymakers is that all policies must begin with the most vulnerable communities in mind. And if you start your policy-making process ensuring that the people who are most vulnerable, the people who are most impacted, the people who are most likely to be left behind, the people who are experiencing the most insecurity, if your policy-making starts with the question, how do we make sure that this group of people is not left behind? How do we make sure that this group of people is not marginalized? How do we make sure that this group of people no longer experiences insecurity? If you start with that as your point of departure, then you're going to craft and develop policy that meets the needs of the whole. But if we accept, Jesus said that the poor will be with you always. But that really was a tongue-in-cheek expression to say that if you continue to do what you're doing, if this society continues to operate the way that it operates, then the poor will always be with us. If people continue to make trite professions, if people continue to pay lip service, then the poor will always be with us. But we don't have to have a society where there is always economic insecurity, where there is always learning gaps, where there is huge inequity in terms of wealth creation, in terms of economic opportunity, in terms of incarceration. Essentially, Doc, what I'm saying is that in order for us to stop leaving children behind, we have to craft our policy positions and our economic forecasts or our economic prescriptions in a way that ensures that we're intentional about eliminating economic insecurity, in a way that shows that we're intentional about making sure that children are not left behind in the classroom, in a way that shows that we're intentional about closing the opportunity gaps. It's frankly outrageous that in 2022, we're still dealing with the kinds of poverty issues that we deal with in this state. We have the resources to fix the problem. And now it's just a question of having the appropriate approach to solving the problem and the political will to solve the problems.
Now that we've outlined what the current situation is, I want to shift the conversation on how we can do things differently as a state to ensure that all Maryland families and children can thrive. I'm thinking of some of the immediate issues facing the state around paid family leave, medical leave implementation, childcare, free and reduced meals across the board. What else would you add to that we should be thinking about, Reverend Little?
Well, I think we certainly need to be thinking about two things that are contemporary issues. One is the ongoing impact of the coronavirus and the attendant pandemic. And then two is this current round of inflation that we're dealing with. It's recently announced that Social Security will be getting federally will be getting one of the largest cost of living adjustments in modern history. I think 8.4%. But in Maryland, we need to be making sure that we're providing the resources that account for the impact of inflation. It's a basic kitchen table issue. You go to the grocery store and things that were $2 last week are $3 this week. And so we've got to make sure that our legislators and the other policymakers in the executive branch are sensitive to how inflation is impacting the most vulnerable in our community. The business community will be quick to have its representatives, its lobbyists, to push for policies that will be favorable to their industries. It's incumbent upon legislators to speak for the most vulnerable in our communities. Organizations like MedSep, the NAACP, and frankly, many others do great work around important issues like paid family leave, like living wage. But at the end of the day, legislators must take an oath to protect the most vulnerable in our communities. And they can do that by developing policies that are ahead of the curve instead of lagging behind. By the time a minimum wage policy goes into effect, or by the time a living wage policy goes into effect, the impact of that policy is negligible because so much time has passed. We needed a $15 an hour living wage or minimum wage 5 years ago. And so $15 today really doesn't get us where we need to be in terms of providing economic security for all Maryland families. And certainly in light of this wave of inflation, $15 doesn't get it. And so we need to stop playing games with the economic lives of our most vulnerable citizens.
Nonso, what else would you add?
So I agree with everything that Reverend Little said. And like Reverend Little was saying, we dealt with the pandemic a few years ago. We're dealing with inflation now. Well, we're still in the pandemic. We're dealing with a recession as well. And all of this, what we're dealing with here, are things that happened prior to the pandemic, consequences of things we didn't face or dealt with prior to the pandemic. So what the pandemic or inflation has done is just to reveal all of these issues, like the good Reverend was saying, that we haven't failed or refused to tackle. So one of the things that I think we should do is that we need to make sure that we do not take steps backwards in our support for working families by continuing the expansions to the end income tax credit. And since we know that getting cash to families is one of the most important and effective tools to improving well-being across all metrics, we should expand Maryland's modest tax credit as it reaches more families. And one of the things I want to mention in this is that we saw what happened on the federal level when the federal child tax credit was passed as part of the recovery package last year. It halved child poverty in half. And the most amazing thing, amazing to me, is that everybody saw this and said it's unbelievable that we're able to reduce the number of kids by half in almost all the nation itself and in Maryland as well. And yet, this was something that was done not permanently, but temporarily. Unlike tax cuts for the wealthy that we've had, that has been there since I think the Bush tax cuts for the wealthy is still there since the early 2000s, and nobody's gotten the courage to repeal those. When it came to tax credit for children, and we saw the immediate impact that it halved poverty, and everybody said this is positive. Yet, it's just temporary. It's like you've done something beneficial to you, you've seen the impact, and you said, okay, well, that's great, I've seen it. It's happened. It's done good for me, but I know that this is positive, but let's just put it in for the records and let's get back to where we were before. It doesn't make any sense. And I think everybody should make sure that we make this permanent because families benefited from it. Secondly, we also need to have greater focus on housing assistance. We've seen, currently all of us have seen the impact of high rent. If you're renting a house, if you're renting an apartment, if you live in a house with the high rate of interest, we know that families are struggling. So we need the high cost of housing in the state is one of the biggest challenges we know families are facing with economic security. And also the recent federal relief program we know was helpful, but it was a short-term solution. And we need to have a much more permanent solution for this problem. And finally, we also have to make sure that the policymakers, with all the end income tax credit we've talked about, we have to make sure that these new programs are supporting families and kids that were passed in the past few years, that like education funding as well, and policy overhaul blueprint for Maryland's future. That we should make sure that this is implemented effectively, fully funded, and producing the benefits that the legislature intended for it to do.
Outstanding. Thank you both so much for sharing your wisdom and your insights. As often we close out with what we call today's action items, literally things you can do today to help begin to build a stronger Maryland. Nonso, what would you recommend for any of our listeners who are interested in supporting efforts to increase economic security for Maryland families?
So one of the issues I talked about was protecting and expanding Maryland's working families tax credits. So if you're interested in learning more about this effort and supporting the campaign, I'll advise our listeners to go to www.taxcreditsformdfamilies.org. That's taxcreditsformdfamilies.org to get information on how to help.
Great. And you, Reverend Little, what would you encourage our listeners to do?
Well, I encourage listeners to do several things. The first is encourage your legislators to keep working on the issue of medical debt. We've already heard about the number of young people 49,000, I think, who are still uninsured. That's an issue that needs to be solved. But Maryland families are also still struggling with medical debt. And so we need legislators to take action on medical debt. I also want to propose an idea for listeners to consider. We ought to have a minimum basic income in Maryland for residents who are, or families who are earning less than $200,000 a year. Now, this may seem like a far out idea until you realize that in the United States now, this currently exists. In Alaska, every single resident gets about $3,000 every year based on the Alaska Natural Resources Reserve. So in Maryland, perhaps we can create a sovereign fund or an investment fund that pays a dividend to every Maryland resident based on the emerging new economies, clean energy, cannabis economy. We have a huge surplus. There's an opportunity for tech economy in Maryland. Why not take some of the funds levied from these industries and invest them in ways that pay dividends to all Marylanders as a supplement to provide economic security? Finally, Dr. Slayton, two calls to action for your listeners today. One is, please visit us at naacpbaltimore.org and join the Baltimore NAACP. You can go to naacp.org and join our national Get Out the Vote efforts. You can register to volunteer, to call or text, or to serve as an election monitor to help turn people out for the coming November 8th election. And I'd encourage all of your listeners to be on the lookout for candidates that are committed to leaving no Marylander behind, to making sure that we don't continue to have persistent economic insecurity in this state. And finally, I tell them to keep listening to this podcast because you guys do great work here.
Thank you so much for that plug. Brother Little, my dear brother Nonso, I want to thank you both for taking time to share with us on this podcast today. You can find podcasts, archives, and references from this episode at mdeconomy.org/policy-lowdown. That's mdeconomy.org/policy-lowdown. While you're there, you can sign up for our email list. You can find the Maryland Center on Economic Policy at MD Economy on both Twitter and Instagram, and MD Economic Policy on Facebook. Again, thank you both for joining us. We hope to see you all next time.
Those that would stand up, call our nation back toward justice and righteousness are often bashed or labeled as socialist and unpatriotic. Many are labeled as instigators and rebel wild round.